Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
Rodney, our guest today is Ben Mandrell. Ben serves as the president and CEO of Lifeway Christian Resources. He was elected that role in 2019. Prior to joining Lifeway, Ben pastored churches in Colorado and Tennessee, and he holds a doctor of ministry degree from Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Outside of Ben's responsibilities at Lifeway, he still preaches at churches all over the country and speaks regularly at leadership training events. And last but not least, he co-hosts, along with his wife Lynley, the Glass House podcast, which focuses on building healthy relationships for ministry leaders and their families. Ben, thank you for joining us today on the StrongTeams.com podcast.
I am honored to be on the show, guys. Thanks for having me.
You know, Ben, before we get started kind of in your Lifeway background and all, I know we were kibitzing a little bit coming in, and you talked just briefly about your experience with leading from your strengths. And I'd love for you to kind of start our time together off the cuff, maybe just telling just a little bit about your experience that you've had with leading from your strengths for our listeners.
Absolutely. I started out as a pastor of a fairly large church. You know, it was one of those deals where God just threw me into the deep end of the pool, and I was pastoring in West Tennessee, having a great experience, and then God called my wife and I to be church planters in Denver, Colorado. Mm-hmm. When we signed on with the North American Mission Board, there was a series of assessments they had us take to better understand ourselves. One of those was Ministry Insights, mm-hmm. and I remember combining my knowledge from that with what I had learned from the Strengths movement, with leading from your strengths. And I don't know that there's ever been a time in my life that I've had a mirror held up to me that was so reflective and clear than when I was taking those assessments. I'm a huge believer in them.
Wow. Well, great. Thank you for those kind words. I tell you, we've been on this journey now for almost 22 years, touched almost 1.3 million leaders. And we hear that over and over and over again. And I can't tell you what great joy it brings to me. And I know for all those listeners that use leading from your strengths, that will be an encouraging word to them as well. And for those that don't know about leading from your strengths that are listening to this podcast, I know that will encourage them as well. So thanks for those kind words. And I appreciate that shout out. So let's get back to you. Lifeway. Tell us a little bit about Lifeway. Our listeners might be familiar with it, might not be. So tell us what Lifeway is.
Well, I would just first start and say Moses never dreamed he would be standing before Pharaoh. I never dreamed I would be a denominational leader leading a Christian resources company. I did not sit in seminary and think that's my aspiration, but Proverbs 16:9, in his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. So here I am. Lifeway is one of the world's largest Christian resource providers. We design trustworthy experiences that fuel ministry for churches. So whether it's a camp experience for their youth group, or a curriculum that helps children's ministry expose kids to Christ, or those little pre-filled communion cups that everybody complains about, we make and sell all that stuff that churches love to have to pull off their weekly ministries. So it's a big team, 750 employees. We're based out of Nashville, but we've gone pretty fully remote now. We're hiring people from all over the country.
So tell us a little bit about your background, the journey to the role of being the CEO and president of Lifeway.
My wife did not marry a pastor. I thought I'd be a biology teacher. I have a chemistry and biology degree. I was at a youth camp serving as a counselor at Kanakuk camps. And I was there because I had a good personality, not because I was athletic. And they asked me to give a talk to the middle school kids. I'd never given a talk before. I didn't know what a sermon was. I just stood up there, took the Bible, and shared a couple of verses and some stories. And I had a few people come up afterwards. I'll never forget this. And the first line the guy said was, "Mandrell, that wasn't horrible." That was like the nicest compliment I could receive. And I just knew that night that God had created me to be a communicator. Like that was the beginning of my dream of like, okay, God, show me who I am. I'm a communicator. And so it made sense after my wife and I got married that the pulpit became something I became interested in. I went to seminary. Next thing I knew, I was being thrown in as the senior pastor of a fairly large church in West Tennessee that I didn't I didn't know how to pastor. I just got thrown in, and God showed me how to do it. And then next thing I knew, we were resigning that church to plant a church in Denver, Colorado from scratch. And I just, man, over and over saw how the Word of God does the work. And when you really just teach the scriptures and allow the Word to do the work, of course, I'm talking like a preacher now. I really think that's the secret sauce of great church ministry. I heard Adrian Rogers say this years ago: if you develop the message, God will develop the ministry. And I've always found that to be true. And so God now threw me into this role at Lifeway, which that would take up the whole podcast to tell that story. But I'm in over my head, but surrounded by great people, and just continuing to daily lead this thing into the future.
You know, one of the greatest marks of a great leader is when they're willing to say, I'm over my head, but I'm surrounded by great people. What a great comment. And I pray our listeners will hit the rewind button and listen to that about 5 times. The greatest mark of a leader is one that says, I'm way in over my head, but God has surrounded me with great leaders. What a great word to open our broadcast. Ben, so you keep mentioning Lynley. Tell us about Lynley. How long you guys been married? How many kids you got? Give us a little background on that.
Lynley is my wife of 21 years. Mm-hmm. She recently started working for a company called Visioneering Studios.
Okay.
That works alongside churches to reimagine in their spaces and their facilities. And so Lynley grew up a builder's daughter. She loves houses, spaces, and churches. So that job really combines all of her favorite things. You know, there's just so many churches right now that need to rethink their lobby. They need to rethink their worship center. Mm-hmm. Space matters, mm-hmm. and that's a whole other deal. But I think environments are largely created by prepared atmospheres. And people like to walk into a prepared atmosphere. And my wife is the best I've ever met at doing that, whether it's in our home or at church. That's what made us great church planners, I think, because I like to do the preaching. She liked to prepare the atmosphere. So it was really fun.
So let's talk a little bit about election. So when Steve did the intro, he said that you were elected to the role of president and CEO. Explain that process for our listeners and how important that is to Lifeway and its mission.
Yeah. When I talk to other CEO friends and I tell them about our board, they just can't believe it, because I have a board of 48 people that fly in from all over the country. They're Sunday school teachers, pastors, they're women's ministry directors. The Southern Baptist Convention has a democratic kind of government, so it's representative. These folks come from different territories, and they have one employee. I'm the only employee of the board. So twice a year, I give them a picture of what's going on at Lifeway. They hold me accountable, and then it's my job to run the organization. They elected me into this role. It's interesting that Lifeway Christian Resources does not receive a single dollar from the Southern Baptist Convention, but we do give back, and we are owned by the Southern Baptist Convention. But we serve a large number of churches that are not Southern Baptist. So it's kind of fun. You get to do both.
Yeah. It's a lot like that business tree model, right? We produce a resource that's worth its value, and that creates sustainability. That's great.
Ben, you've been president and CEO for about 4 years now. What was the biggest learning curve for you in this role that you're in today?
I would say the biggest thing I've had to learn is I've had to adjust my thinking from week to week ministry to 3 to 5 years out. Mm-hmm. If we sign you as an author right now, it's going to take us a couple of years to publish your book. By the time you write it, we design it, we edit it, we market it, we get it out the door, it's going to be 2025. When you're a pastor, you're mostly thinking about next Sunday and how you're going to pull off another week of volunteers and parking and all that. So it's taken me almost 4 years to get used to a brand new rhythm of life. This is a big ship that moves slow, but also sinks slow. Mm-hmm. So it's just been hard to adjust to that because of the urgency in me that likes to see things happen. Like, I remember as a pastor, there were weeks where you could literally feel the organization of the church just moved forward this Sunday. Like God did something. The church just took a step forward. You cannot operate like that as a corporate leader. And you don't have those moments very often. And you just got to get used to that.
You talked about Lifeway being a ship. It's been around for at least 100 years. Is that correct?
Correct. 1891.
Okay. Wow. Wow, still going strong. Speaking of time, there's been a lot of change in America over the last 10 years. The country's demographic has changed, buying habits have changed, church models have had to change. Has Lifeway's ministry model had to evolve over the last 5-10 years?
100%. We are not the same Lifeway that we were. And I think this is true in any organization. I think about every 7 years is the number I think is true, that you have to basically reinvent yourself. It has to be completely different than it used to be. And Lifeway used to be known for its stores. We had 174 bookstores. Prior to my coming, the math was no longer making sense, and customers had clearly voted loudly that they like ordering stuff online. Still liked coming into the stores, just weren't buying anything in the store. And so Lifeway had to make a decision that we were either going to have a future or we were going to have stores. And yet, every single time I preach in a church, with almost no exception, the first question I get when people come up to me is, when are you going to reopen those stores? And believe me, I love walking through a bookstore. Like, there's nothing that makes me happier. That's like a room full of puppies. Okay. I can't wait to get in a bookstore. But we have to accept the fact that we live in a world now where people like the convenience of shopping online, and it's an Amazon-driven world. We all know that. So Lifeway's had to have the funeral, as have our churches, on how we used to do things in order to move forward into the future and serve the church.
Yeah, you serve such a large team and lead such a large team at Lifeway. How many employees Lifeway have now?
Right now we have a little over 700, and we'd like to get to 750 tomorrow. But as you guys know, it is a tough market right now for hiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we're interviewing for over 50 positions right now. So if you're out there and you're a very gifted graphic designer, content creator, hey, check out lifeway.com/jobs.
A shameless plug there. So
duly noted.
Come on.
And I know, Ben, that you guys, mostly y'all work remote now. This whole team primarily works remote. So this is the strongteams.com podcast. Seems like we probably ought to talk about strong teams. So tell me what you do specifically in order to help build a more strong, united team at Lifeway, especially with you guys being spread out all over the country.
Absolutely. Here's the best lesson I ever learned about leadership. Here it is. I don't got much more than this. Culture is created by the positive behaviors we celebrate and the negative behaviors we tolerate.
I love it.
Everything that I do as a leader flows out of that statement. So every time I get a chance to catch someone in the act of doing something that we want repeated, we got to celebrate that. Mm-hmm. Every time I notice something that's not the way we should do it, I am a bad leader if I turn a blind eye to it. Mm-hmm. And so right now we're going through a theme right now in our company called Compassionate Candor, where we're training our employees to stop using Christian niceness as a cover for not telling people the truth about how they're really doing on the job. And so we've just got to create a culture that's transparent and vulnerable and real, where evaluations mean something. And we're trying to do that through a remote environment. Twice a year, we run out a mega church in Nashville, and we bring the entire team in, and we do a 2-day, just kind of, I call it our own passion conference. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's high-powered music, there's great worship, there's great speakers. We try to cast vision on where we're going as a company, and we've been feeding off that energy pretty well as people scatter, go back to their homes, and we bring them back every 6 months. That's working for us. And we're getting ready to open a brand new state-of-the-art teaming space that costs a fraction of what we were paying for a fancy downtown building one year ago, which we sold, and we don't regret it.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the teaming space. That's very intriguing to me.
Absolutely. So it's super fun, super bright, very intentionally decorated. A space for teams to collaborate, different kinds of conference rooms for different kinds of work, a lot of place for ideating, whiteboarding. Everybody walks in through the same door through a coffee shop. So cross-functional people have to hang out, no silos. But it's really a place for people to gather and come up with great ideas. And then they can go back home and walk their dogs and do their work from their desk, where they'd rather be. Mm-hmm. And also, everybody commuting to downtown Nashville was becoming a huge obstacle for us. Mm-hmm. The traffic, the inefficiency, and not to mention, we need a larger talent pool than just Middle Tennessee. Mm-hmm. So this model is working great for us.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody gets a raise, right, for the gas they save driving to work every week. I mean, and lunches out and all that kind of good stuff. That's amazing.
Totally.
Great idea. Great idea. Maybe some of our listeners, that'll spark some thoughts in them. Almost like that co-shared working space, right? So really, really cool idea.
That's exactly what it's right. Except it's our own personal WeWork.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I had to die to, I'll just be honest with you, I love walk around management.
Mm-hmm.
I love just being able to walk up and say, how you doing?
Mm-hmm.
I've had to let that go. I've had to let it go because that's not where we are in the world today.
Ben, just the nature of what Lifeway does, it's always had the finger on. It's required to have the finger on the pulse of the local church. And we're primarily talking to a lot of leaders and up-and-coming leaders out there. What would you say the biggest challenge senior leaders are facing today in vocational church ministry?
I would say the number one thing I'm seeing is burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Senior pastors, I mean, everybody else is back after COVID, everybody except the pastor's heart.
Mm.
It took so many years out of pastors to fight battles about masks and quarantine. And it was like going to war, and they still have PTSD, but everybody else feels fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I was with a group of state convention leaders last week, and one state was saying as high as 20% of their churches right now are looking for a senior pastor.
Mm-hmm.
You asked me what my main concern about the future of the kingdom is right now. There just aren't a lot of people saying yes to ministry anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that are tired, and we're going to need reinforcements, and we're going to have to raise up leaders to take over these churches.
So what are you doing nowadays? What's Lifeway actually doing to actually equip and educate these church leaders in their, kind of how their roles are evolving and how to take a deep breath and get some space?
Man, it's hard, because how do you do something that raises what's the rising tide that raises all the boats?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is one. Mm-hmm. My wife came up with this idea. I give all the credit to her, but the Glass House podcast that we started really began with the thought of, how do we encourage so many ministry leaders right now that are thinking about quitting?
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to do it is to help them feel less alone.
Mm-hmm.
So we started recording these conversations with vulnerable pastors and vulnerable wives who just talk about unique pressures of living in a glass house and raising kids in it and dealing with ugly emails on Monday morning. Mm-hmm. And we didn't fix a thing in their local church other than to tell them they're not the only ones dealing with
Mm-hmm.
it. And there's encouragement in that. So we've been trying to encourage pastors to hang in there and to believe that better days are coming. And a lot of our churches are coming back, and it's slowly beginning to feel like the old world again.
That's a great idea for a podcast that has been needed for a long time. Speaking of that, I'm noticing that Lifeway is in the leadership space now more than ever. I've noticed even some leadership podcasts out there. Can you just speak to that briefly?
Yeah, I'm always a little bit nervous about anything we call leadership, mm-hmm. because I don't like the idea of Lifeway being on the platform teaching churches how to do it.
Okay.
Our role is actually to be side by side with church leaders, and we have this amazing shop where we go and custom create tools that help them lead. Mm-hmm. So servant leadership is definitely our role. Our job is to listen really carefully to what churches need and go and build it and save them the time of building it themselves. So our best way of leading, and this is the Jesus way, is really by serving mm-hmm. and helping them in their unique ministries. We are nervous about anything that's a one-size-fits-all. Mm-hmm. Churches are just so different in their orientation, their location, their context. Everybody has to customize their stuff. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to create more and more stuff that's flexible, mm-hmm. that can be, adapted easily in their environment.
Yeah, it makes total sense. As more and more young leaders are entering the ministry, what is it that you think they could do to help increase their success? Like, especially with the challenges of today, like what would be some nuggets you could give for young leaders entering the ministry?
Yeah, I would say fill the 4 buckets. And here are the 4 buckets that healthy pastors are filling. And this is by spending, I'm talking hours and hours and hours on the road hanging out with these pastors. The ones that still love their jobs, they're filling 4 buckets. And there's just common sense, but common sense is not common practice. It's family, friendship, health, and hobbies. It's those 4 things that keep ministry from taking over your soul.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll mention each of them real quick.
Yeah.
Most pastors are very bad at friendship. They feel very alone. They feel like no one understands them, and they make themselves martyrs and victims. They don't go out and seek out friendship. And I'll be honest, it's been a challenge for me my whole life. I tend to hole up and wall up, and it's really not healthy. Hobbies. There were things that you were interested in before you became a pastor that made you interesting. And you gave them all up to be a pastor, and now you're not interesting. You're actually quite boring. The pastors I know that are healthy, they like to woodwork, they like to mountain bike. They figured out some things that make them feel like human beings. Family. I'm not talking about just being home with your family. If there is an ongoing chronic issue in your extended family, and you're not ignoring it in the name of church, you're going to burn out. That issue is going to become larger than it is right now. And then finally, it's just health. Are you going to the doctor? Are you exercising regularly? Are you eating the right things? Basic things that other people realize. Pastors are not immune from that stuff. It affects your ministry. And so, if you're vastly overweight, but your church is growing, that's a problem. So I've just found healthy pastors really take those 4 things seriously, and then they have longer endurance because they don't let the church take over their whole life.
I love that 4 buckets. And I'll tell you what it does. It models for the rest of the staff as well, healthy habits on that church staff. And a healthy staff is directly related, in my opinion, to a healthy congregation. So I love the 4 buckets.
I love that too, because I was told this once. This isn't mine. I stole it. But there are pastors who focus on growth, and there are pastors who focus on health. And if you focus on health, growth is always a natural byproduct. Healthy things grow. So if you're going to focus on one or the other, just focus on being the healthiest person you can be with healthy relationships with your staff, and then see what the Holy Spirit does with that. I have seen over the years that God blesses that.
Amen. There's no doubt about it. We've seen it over and over again. We actually ascribe to a principle that you can have all the leadership acumen in the world, but if you don't have relationship, you really don't have anything. Relational capital is the most important thing a leader can possess. And it takes work, right? And it takes understanding and empathy of the people in which you're leading, and it takes trust. And all 3 of those things are not easily acquired and easily lost when we're not spending quality time with each other. So talk about podcasts, books that you would recommend to our listeners.
Well, first, I wanted to say this. Episode 1 of the Glass House podcast is Lynley and I speaking very vulnerably about how we almost lost our marriage when we came to Lifeway. It took us far too long to humble ourselves and go see a counselor. Being in ministry, just by nature, you take on all this toxic stuff, and you're not good at dealing with it, because if Sunday's coming and you got to be seen publicly with your wife, it's all got to get cleaned up by Saturday night. So most pastors just put stuff under the rug and it festers. So when I came to Lifeway after 17 years of being a senior pastor, I didn't realize it. I'm still having to deal with it. There's a lot of stuff that stacks up that needs to be handled, addressed, and discussed. So I would just strongly encourage any pastor out there, any ministry leader, don't wait until your marriage is a disaster to go to counseling. Start now. Start now. Resources I recommend?
Yes, sir.
Man, I just stumbled onto Masterclass. Have you guys done that?
I haven't taken one yet, but they look interesting. So many different classes.
Oh my goodness. So Masterclass is an opportunity to learn from the best in every field. So if you're interested in writing, you can take Malcolm Gladwell's Masterclass, and he's just sitting there telling you his process, how he does it, how he goes about it. I just listened to James Patterson talk about how he writes a novel. It was fascinating. I mean, he writes the whole thing out on a yellow legal pad and his secretary types it out. I just thought that was so interesting. So I love, my number one strength and strength finder is learner.
Okay.
So I love any podcast where I'm learning something.
It's been fascinating learning from the leaders that we've had. Steve and I are always taking away nuggets from them, and we're doing these quarterly nugget broadcasts now. What are kind of the things that impacted us out of those interviews and how we've applied them. And so that's been a lot of fun. Steve, what about you?
Lately, I stumbled upon Andrew Huberman. He's a neuroscientist out of Stanford that has a podcast called the Huberman Lab. He's not a believer, but he just tackles a lot of things of, how the brain is connected to the body and what are healthy habits. Back to health, he just covers a lot of really practical things and the physiological reasons behind why you need to do these things just to keep yourself healthy and well balanced physically. And so I've been listening to Andrew Huberman on my walks each week.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Are you able to listen to Simon Sinek without deeply resenting him for being so good at talking?
Yeah.
Like, why is he so compelling? I
Yeah,
don't understand that.
It's a gift.
He is so articulate, and it just makes me so sad about my inability to communicate like that. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I call myself cynical, if I'm being really honest. When somebody is so perfectly, when their delivery is so perfect and they have all the answers, I tend to be a little cynical and take away nuggets instead of the whole thing. But yes, Simon Sinek, he's the master. He is so good.
He is. I would say the most impactful podcast I've ever listened to was The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill.
Yes.
I just thought the way that Cosper put that together, the music, the production, like I was so mesmerized by that. And I just thought he did an amazing job of making you think about what health is in the church and how do we avoid this from continuing to happen?
Yeah. We're big fans of that as well. We've been in touch with Cosper as well. I'd love to have him on as a guest because just if it isn't already obvious, we really subscribe and ascribe to everything that you've been saying, that there needs to be a wake up call in leadership circles these days, a focus on health, a focus on teams. And so we're a big fan of that podcast as well.
Yeah, it was really good, Ben. And I say, what are we doing? When I say me and you, Ben, what are we doing and what we're writing and what we're producing in order to create a counter narrative to that? Because if you think about it, the rise and fall of Mars Hill for the last 15 years, these principles have been permeated into the leadership of our churches. That's the truth. And what are we doing? What are we doing to help those leaders get healthy and get rid of some of those principles that aren't full of the truth and are leading them into box canyons, hurting a lot of people along the way. And once again, as we've already stated, actually isolating themselves even more than they ever intended or ever thought those principles would isolate them.
I deal with celebrity Christians all the time. That's what we do. We publish people who are really good at communicating or writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would say it is a unique form of suffering. I mean that. Like we talk about missionary suffering. When you're a very well-known writer or author, it is a lonely life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to become kind of walled off from community, from church, from relationships. Mm-hmm. And you can see why it continues to happen, that people struggle with fame. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we've learned anything from the last 10 years, have we not learned that the human soul was not designed for fame? Mm-hmm. How many more people have to fall when they get on that ice of success? Mm-hmm. And so even at Lifeway, I'm constantly looking at myself and thinking, am I becoming too high on my own self? Am I becoming self-promotional? It's a hard balance in a world. If you want to be influential, you have to, tweet yourself 3 times a day.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to put people around you and look them square in the eye and say, listen, you have to keep me accountable. I have to be able to walk in the light with you. I have to be able to confess my sin to you that I might be healed. I need that intimacy, and I need that tough love, that truly speaking the truth in love. And that's important.
And I would add that those people do not need to work for you. That you don't need to have any influence on their paycheck or their stability in their job. Those people need to be folks outside of that circle for you to get those that real accountability.
100%. One of the best things I've ever read on leadership is C.S. Lewis's article called "The Inner Ring." And it's basically him talking to a group of college students. And he says, hey, I want to warn you guys, some of you in this room are going to be scoundrels. And just statistically, that's going to happen. And when you show up as a scoundrel one day, I want you to know how you got there. Here's how it happens. As you get out of college, you're going to go work somewhere, and you're going to find a group of people that use collective language, like we meet on Saturday and we do it like this. And for whatever reason, you're going to feel like you need to be a part of that ring. So you're going to start doing things to be seen certain places or to be perceived a certain way. And lo and behold, one day they're going to invite you into the ring, and you will think you will have arrived. But what they didn't tell you is that there's another ring inside the ring. And so you're going to spend more time trying to penetrate that ring, and on it goes until you get to the very end. And it's like the layers of an onion. When you finally get to the middle, there's nothing left. It's empty.
What a good
and
word.
What I see in Christianity today, and I'm tempted to do it every day, is to think, why am I not invited to that conference? Why am I not included in that conversation? And what would it take for me to penetrate that ring? The minute I go there, I know I have walked down the devil's path. It's not God's will for me. So I just think we need to talk more about it, guys. The temptation is so real for all of us.
So listen, what's the one question I haven't asked you that I should have asked you, Ben, before we close our time? And what would your answer have been?
I think it's vulnerability. I think if you look at the passage where Paul talks about the thorn in his flesh and why God allowed him to have that weakness, it's so that he would have to rely on other people for strength, and so that he would not exalt himself. In fact, he says, in order to keep me from being conceited, God gave me this thorn in my flesh. So recently at an all Lifeway gathering, I told our entire team about the very painful relationship I have with my parents. And how that has affected me, and how it's hurt me, and how I've had to deal with that over the years. I think my leadership with those employees took 10 steps forward by simply talking about pain in my life. If I had stood up there and said, here's 5 leadership principles I've learned how you can be a better leader, it would not have had the same impact as just showing people weakness.
Amen.
So I want to work for somebody. I'm waiting to go to the conference. It hasn't happened yet, where the leader stands up and says, let me tell you the 3 biggest mistakes I've ever made and what I learned from them. I'm listening to that guy.
That's great.
That's vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And here's the definition of vulnerability that I think somebody gave this to me. You are being vulnerable when you're giving someone enough information they could hurt you with it. And I don't think very many pastors are vulnerable with anybody. If they're having fantasies about another woman or leaving the ministry to go work on a bridge, they're not telling anybody about that. Somebody needs to know you're having those thoughts and feelings. You can't handle that alone.
So Ben, we're incredibly grateful for your time today. We know that you're incredibly busy, and we truly are grateful. Our listeners will be encouraged by everything that you've said here today, great leadership principles. And listen, if you want to find out more about Ben, you can go to benmandrell.com. That's benmandrell.com. And you can find him there. And Ben, once again, thank you for being on strongteams.com podcast.
Hey. Great to meet you guys. Hey, I hope we can partner again in the future and do some stuff together. I love what you guys are up to.
Yeah, thank you. Until we meet again, God bless.